The city bus creaked to a stop at a nondescript corner of downtown, the air outside thick with the smell of rain-soaked asphalt and the faint aroma of a nearby food truck. Inside, the muted murmur of conversations blended with the gentle hum of the engine, an everyday backdrop for the late afternoon commuters. Ezra Turner sat near the middle of the bus, his hands loosely gripping the top of a white cane that rested between his knees. His head was slightly tilted as though he were listening for something specific, though his sightless eyes betrayed no indication of what it might be. The movement of the bus felt familiar under his feet. The lurch forward, the brakes hissing, the subtle sway that came with every turn. At 31, Ezra had grown accustomed to navigating a world that didn't seem designed for him. Being blind was one thing. Being blind and black often felt like a double-edged sword, cutting him in ways he couldn't always explain. Most days he pushed the thoughts aside, focusing instead on the steady rhythm of his life. His part-time job at the community center, his love for jazz records, and the daily challenge of mastering the art of independence. Today, though, felt different. The moment he had stepped onto the bus, Ezra had sensed a shift in the air, a kind of quiet tension that he couldn't see but could feel. He hadn't paid it much mind at first. It wasn't unusual for people to fall silent when he entered a space, sometimes out of discomfort, sometimes out of curiosity. But as he settled into his seat, a faint prickle of unease crawled up his spine. "Hey, you're blocking the aisle," a voice barked from a few seats away. Ezra turned his head slightly, his lips parting as if to respond, but the voice had already moved past him, replaced by the shuffling of feet and the sound of someone collapsing heavily into a seat. He didn't need sight to know who it was. The man's presence radiated hostility. Ezra could hear it in the way he muttered under his breath, the words indistinct but laced with venom. He could feel it in the occasional snort of derision that cut through the otherwise calm bus ride. The man's voice was gruff, tinged with an edge of self-righteousness, and though Ezra couldn't see the glares being shot in his direction, he could feel the weight of them. The other passengers seemed to sense it too. Conversations died down, and the bus grew quieter with every passing block. Ezra tried to focus on the familiar sounds outside, the whoosh of cars, the rhythmic clatter of the bus over potholes. But the tension inside the vehicle was impossible to ignore. "People like you shouldn't even be out here," the man muttered, just loud enough for Ezra to hear. Ezra froze. His grip tightened on his cane, the familiar texture of the handle grounding him. He wasn't new to this kind of hostility. It was a song he had heard too many times before, its melody as bitter as it was predictable. But that didn't make it any easier to stomach. "Excuse me?" Ezra said, his voice calm but firm. There was a pause, and for a moment, Ezra thought the man might back down. But then came the laugh, a harsh, mocking sound that made Ezra's chest tighten. "You heard me," the man said, his tone dripping with disdain. "Maybe if you weren't so busy being a burden, you'd—" "Hey, that's enough," a woman's voice cut in sharply from the front of the bus. The man fell silent, but the tension lingered. Ezra could hear the woman murmuring something to the driver, her voice too low to make out. And then the bus resumed its steady crawl through the city. Ezra adjusted his position, his mind racing. He wasn't one to let strangers' words get under his skin, but this was different. It wasn't just the insult. It was the sheer audacity of it, the way the man's hatred seemed to fill the space like a toxic cloud. But as the minutes ticked by, something strange began to happen. Ezra noticed the subtle shift in the other passengers, the way they whispered to one another, their voices tinged with urgency. He could feel the energy in the air changing, like the electric charge before a storm. And then he heard it. "Sir?" The bus driver's voice came from the front, firm but measured. "You need to come up here for a second." The man grumbled something under his breath but didn't move. "I said now," the driver repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. Ezra tilted his head, his senses sharpening. There was something unusual about the driver's voice, a hint of authority that went beyond the usual reprimand. The man finally rose from his seat, his boot stomping down the aisle as he made his way toward the front of the bus. For a few moments, there was only silence, broken by the faint hiss of the bus's air brakes as it slowed to a stop. Ezra listened, intently trying to piece together what was happening, and then, just as the man reached the front of the bus, a new voice rang out. "I'd like a word with you." The voice was deep and steady, with an unmistakable edge of command. It was a voice that didn't ask for respect, it demanded it. Ezra's heart skipped a beat. The man's footsteps faltered, and for the first time, there was a hint of uncertainty in his voice. What's this about?" Ezra strained to hear the response, but it was drowned out by the sudden shuffle of passengers adjusting in their seats. He could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the way the air seemed to crackle with anticipation. "Sir," the driver said again, his voice calm but firm. "You're going to want to listen to what this man has to say." Ezra's fingers tightened around his cane. He didn't know who the new voice belonged to or why the driver sounded so insistent. But one thing was clear. Something significant was happening. And for the first time in a long while, Ezra felt a flicker of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, justice was about to be served. But before he could make sense of the moment, the bus doors hissed open, and the sound of approaching footsteps filled the air. Ezra's breath caught in his throat as he realized someone else was stepping onto the bus. Someone who carried an air of authority so palpable it seemed to quiet even the most unruly voices. The man at the front stammered, his earlier bravado melting away. "Wait. You're..." Ezra leaned forward, his pulse quickening. And then, just as the tension reached its breaking point, the deep voice spoke again, cutting through the silence like a blade. "Let's talk about who you've been harassing." Ezra tightened his grip on the worn handle of his cane, a habit he'd developed when things felt unpredictable. It was more than just a tool for navigation. It was his anchor, a constant in a world that often shifted without warning. The voices at the front of the bus grew fainter, blending with the muted hum of the engine. His other senses sharpened as he focused on the environment, trying to decode what was unfolding. The man's voice wavered, his earlier arrogance giving way to something Ezra couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe, or surprise. The deep, commanding voice that had spoken moments earlier carried an unyielding calm, the kind of tone Ezra recognized as belonging to someone who held both power and integrity. Ezra's thoughts flickered back to his late mother, the person who had always been his source of strength. "Never let them make you small, baby," she'd told him once, her voice steady but warm. She had been his greatest advocate, helping him navigate a world that wasn't always kind to him. When he'd lost his sight at 14 after a severe case of optic neuritis, she'd been the one to remind him that blindness didn't define him, but even her fierce love couldn't shield him from the harshness of reality. Ezra had grown up in a working-class neighborhood where opportunities were scarce, and prejudices lingered like cracks in the pavement. As a teenager, he'd quickly learned how to recognize the subtle shifts in tone, the hushed whispers, and the heavy silences that signaled he was unwelcome. It wasn't always overt. It was the cashier who handed him his change like he was contagious, the landlord who suddenly lost his rental application, or the so-called jokes that left him feeling more alienated than amused. "Ezra, you don't owe them anything," his mother had said one evening when he'd come home from school, dejected after a teacher suggested he lower his expectations for college. "You just keep walking your path no matter how many times they try to trip you up. You hear me?" And he had tried, but some days were harder than others. The bus jolted to a stop, snapping Ezra out of his thoughts. The sound of heavy boots shuffling down the steps echoed in his ears, followed by the faint click of a camera shutter. Ezra frowned. He wasn't sure what was happening, but whatever it was, it seemed to have everyone's attention. "Is everything okay up there?" Ezra asked softly, directing his question to the woman sitting across from him. There was a pause before she responded. I think someone's getting involved. Like, really involved." Her voice was hesitant but tinged with curiosity. Ezra tilted his head, processing her words. He could feel the energy on the bus shifting again, the tension thickening like an approaching storm. The deep voice spoke again. louder this time. You think you can get away with this kind of behavior because no one's paying attention, but you're wrong. People see you. I see you. The man mumbled something in response, his voice defensive, but Ezra couldn't make out the words. The woman across from him leaned closer. I don't know who that guy is, she whispered, but he's not someone you mess with. Ezra nodded slowly, though he still couldn't piece together the full picture. The conversation up front grew more heated, the commanding voice cutting through the man's feeble attempts at justification. Ezra picked up fragments, something about accountability, about consequences. The voices faded into the background as Ezra's thoughts wandered again. He thought about the community center where he worked part-time, helping run a music program for kids. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it was one that mattered to him. Music had always been his escape, his way of connecting to a world he couldn't see. He'd learned to play the piano by ear when he was 9, spending hours at the old upright piano in his church's basement. It was there he discovered his love for jazz, the way it seemed to echo both joy and pain in equal measure. At the community center, Ezra often found himself mentoring kids who reminded him of his younger self, lost, overlooked, searching for something to hold on to. He didn't tell them about his own struggles, at least not directly, but he hoped they could see it in him anyway, that despite everything, he was still standing. The sound of footsteps interrupted his thoughts again. Ezra straightened, his senses on high alert. Someone was walking toward him, their stride deliberate. He heard the faint swish of fabric, the rustle of a coat. Mr. Turner? Ezra's brow furrowed. The voice was unfamiliar but calm, professional. Yes? I'd like to have a word with you if that's all right. Ezra nodded, though he wasn't sure what was happening. Of course. What's this about? There was a pause, as if the person was choosing their words carefully. It's about what just happened, and about making sure this doesn't happen again. Before Ezra could respond, the deep voice from earlier spoke again, this time addressing the entire bus. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you for your patience. This situation has been documented and appropriate steps are being taken to address it. If anyone else witnessed the incident and would like to provide a statement, please see me before you leave the bus. The murmurs among the passengers grew louder, a mix of relief and curiosity. Ezra could feel the weight of the moment settling over him. The man who had harassed him had gone quiet, his earlier bravado completely gone. Ezra imagined him shrinking in his seat, exposed for what he truly was. The person standing beside Ezra spoke again, their voice softer this time. Mr. Turner, I think you'll find that there are more people in your corner than you might realize. Ezra tilted his head, considering the words. He wanted to believe them, but years of experience had taught him to be cautious. As the bus began to move again, Ezra felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, gratitude, and something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot, but for the first time in a long while he felt the faintest glimmer of hope. And yet, there was something else lingering in the air, an unspoken tension that hinted at more to come. Ezra couldn't shake the feeling that this moment was just the beginning of something much larger, something that would challenge him in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The bus rolled to a halt at the next stop, its brakes hissing as the doors opened. A chilly gust of January air swept through the vehicle, carrying with it the faint scent of exhaust and damp pavement. Ezra shivered slightly, pulling his jacket closer around him. The murmurs among the passengers had died down, leaving a strange, almost eerie silence. The man who had harassed him earlier, still seated at the front, hadn't said another word, but Ezra could feel his hostility radiating like an unwelcome heat. The tension hadn't subsided. If anything, it had settled into a kind of uneasy stalemate, thick and suffocating. Ezra's fingers toyed with the strap of his messenger bag, a nervous habit he'd picked up in recent years. He couldn't see the expressions of the other passengers, but he could imagine them, curious glances, awkward avoidance, perhaps even a few pitying stares. He hated that the incident had drawn so much attention to him, hated the vulnerability it exposed. The man's gruff voice broke the silence, muttered but unmistakably loud enough for Ezra to hear. Guess I'm not supposed to say anything now. Gotta be careful with all the bleeding hearts around here. Ezra's jaw tightened. He didn't respond, not immediately. He knew that rising to the bait would only make things worse, but the words still landed like sharp blows. He could feel the weight of every microaggression, every dismissive glance, every moment of invisibility that had piled up over the years. "You've got something to say, sir?" A voice chimed in from across the aisle. It was the same woman who had spoken up earlier. Her tone was firm, edged with frustration. The man let out a derisive snort. "Just making an observation. Don't see why everyone's so sensitive these days." Ezra turned his head toward the woman's voice, feeling a flicker of gratitude for her willingness to step in. She didn't owe him anything, and yet she had chosen to stand up against the man's cruelty. "Maybe," Ezra said, his voice steady but laced with quiet defiance. "People are just tired of pretending this kind of behavior is acceptable." A few heads turned at his words, and for a moment, the bus seemed to hold its breath. Ezra wasn't sure what kind of reaction to expect. Anger, perhaps, or disbelief, but the silence that followed was heavy with unspoken tension. The man shifted, in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with the sudden spotlight. "Oh, so now I'm the bad guy for speaking my mind. Give me a break." Ezra leaned forward slightly, gripping his cane as if it were a lifeline. "There's a difference between speaking your mind and tearing someone else down just because you can. Maybe you should think about that." The man didn't respond, but Ezra could feel the heat of his glare. The other passengers were silent, their attention fixed on the unfolding exchange. Ezra's pulse quickened, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't used to confronting people like this, wasn't used to having his voice heard. And yet, in this moment he felt a strange, unexpected strength. That strength came from somewhere deep within him, a place shaped by years of perseverance and the unwavering support of those who had believed in him. He thought of his mother again, her voice steady and reassuring. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone, Ezra. Just be the best version of yourself, and that'll be enough." Her words echoed in his mind like a mantra, grounding him in a way that nothing else could. The bus lurched forward again, and Ezra felt the momentum pull him slightly off balance. The momentary distraction gave him a chance to collect himself, to breathe. He could sense that the man wasn't finished, though. There was a kind of energy to him, a restless hostility that seemed to demand an outlet. Sure enough, a few minutes later, the man muttered something under his breath, just loud enough for Ezra to catch. "Can't even see where you're going. But you've got all the answers, huh?" The words hit harder than Ezra expected, a sharp reminder of the barriers he faced daily. But before he could respond, the deep, commanding voice from earlier spoke again. "That's enough." The man froze, his bravado faltering. Ezra tilted his head, straining to hear the man's reaction. "Who are you to tell me what's enough?" the man said, his voice rising with defensive anger. The commanding voice didn't waver. "I'm someone who doesn't tolerate this kind of behavior. You've made your point. Now it's time to stop." Ezra didn't recognize the voice, but there was something about it that felt authoritative, almost protective. He wondered who the person was and why they had chosen to intervene so decisively. The man muttered something unintelligible, but he didn't push further. The tension on the bus remained thick, but the immediate threat seemed to have dissipated. Ezra felt a strange mix of relief and apprehension, as if he were standing on the edge of something much larger than himself. As the bus approached the next stop, Ezra heard the faint rustle of movement behind him. A moment later, someone slid into the seat beside him. "Hey," the voice said softly. It was the woman who had spoken up earlier. Ezra turned his head slightly, offering a small smile. "Hey, you okay?" she asked, her tone gentle but concerned. Ezra hesitated before nodding. "I've been through worse." She let out a small, rueful laugh. "I believe that. But that doesn't mean you should have to deal with this kind of garbage." Ezra shrugged, though her words brought a sense of comfort. "It's not the first time, and it probably won't be the last. People like him don't change overnight." The woman was silent for a moment, as if weighing her response. "Maybe not, but that doesn't mean they get a free pass to treat you like this," Ezra nodded, appreciating her sincerity. Thanks for speaking up earlier, I mean. She smiled, though Ezra couldn't see it. It was the right thing to do, and for what it's worth, I think you handled it really well. Ezra chuckled, softly. I'm not sure about that, but thanks. The bus slowed to a stop again, and the woman stood, preparing to exit. Take care of yourself, okay? You too, Ezra said, his voice sincere. As the doors closed behind her, Ezra leaned back in his seat, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that the events of the day were leading to something bigger, something he couldn't yet see. And then, just as the bus began to move again, the deep voice spoke one last time. Mr. Turner, I'd like to speak with you privately when we reach the last stop. Ezra's heart skipped a beat. He had no idea who this person was or why they seemed so invested in his situation, but something about their tone made him feel both curious and cautious. The bus continued its journey, the cityscape blurring into a haze of lights and shadows. Ezra tightened his grip on his cane, bracing himself for whatever was to come. He had faced challenges before, but something told him that this was different. This wasn't just about one man's hatred or one moment of confrontation. This was about something deeper, something that had the potential to change everything. As the bus neared its final stop, Ezra felt a strange mix of fear and determination. He didn't know what awaited him, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to back down. The bus slowed to a stop at the station's final terminal, its air brakes hissing like a serpent. Ezra remained seated, listening as the other passengers shuffled off one by one. Their footsteps echoed against the metal floor, accompanied by hushed murmurs and the occasional clink of keys or bags. He heard the man who had harassed him earlier stomp down the steps, muttering bitterly to himself. Ezra's muscles tensed, instinctively his grip on the cane tightening. Even though the man had left, his presence lingered in the air like a noxious gas. Mr. Turner, the voice from earlier called gently. Ezra turned his head toward the sound. Yes? I'm Officer Williams. The man's voice was calm and professional, but there was an undertone of something warmer, empathy perhaps. I'd like to speak with you for a moment before you leave. Ezra hesitated. The word officer sent a ripple of unease through him. He'd had his fair share of tense encounters with authority figures, and even the kindest ones had a way of making him feel scrutinized. Still, there was something different about this man's tone. Of course, Ezra said cautiously. The officer approached, his footsteps deliberate but unthreatening. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, as though he were mindful of the vulnerability that came with being blind. I wanted to check on you first. That man's behavior was unacceptable, and I want you to know we're handling it. We've documented the incident, and he'll face consequences. Ezra nodded slowly, absorbing the information. Thank you, he said quietly. Officer Williams hesitated, then added, I also wanted to commend you. You handled yourself with a lot of grace back there. Not everyone would have. Ezra offered a small, tight smile. It didn't feel graceful, at the time. Williams chuckled lightly, the sound putting Ezra somewhat at ease. Sometimes the strongest people don't feel strong in the moment, but I think you did more than you realize. Before Ezra could respond, another sound caught his attention, the faint scuff of boots on pavement moving closer. His pulse quickened as he recognized the heavy, deliberate gait. The man hadn't left. Officer, the man sneered, his voice cutting through the station's quiet. You've got no right to treat me like some kind of criminal. I didn't do anything wrong. Ezra's stomach twisted. He turned his head slightly, angling his ear toward the sound. You harassed another passenger, Williams replied firmly. That's enough to warrant intervention. Harassment? Give me a break, the man shot back. I was just talking. Since when is talking illegal? Ezra could feel the man's anger building, his words dripping with defiance. He wasn't backing down. Instead, he was doubling down, feeding off his own bitterness. You know what your problem is? The man continued, his voice rising. You people are always looking for something to be offended by. Can't even have a normal conversation without someone crying racism. Ezra flinched at the venom in the man's words. The thin veneer of civility had completely cracked, revealing the full extent of his hostility. "That's enough," Officer Williams said sharply. His voice was steady, but there was an unmistakable edge to it now. "If you don't leave this station immediately, you'll be escorted out." The man let out a bitter laugh. "Figures, protecting him, huh? Don't want to hurt anyone's feelings." Ezra's hands trembled slightly as he gripped his cane. He didn't want to give the man the satisfaction of knowing he was rattled, but the words stung all the same. Before he could process what was happening, the man's footsteps grew louder, closer. Ezra's senses went into overdrive, his body instinctively tensing. "What's he even doing here, huh?" The man spat, his voice now directed squarely at Ezra. "Walking around like he owns the place, acting like he's better than everyone else. What's your deal, huh? You think being blind makes you special?" Ezra didn't respond. He couldn't. The words caught in his throat, tangled with a mixture of fear and anger. "Back away," Officer Williams said firmly, stepping between them. "Now." The man hesitated, his arrogance faltering for the first time. Ezra could hear the tension in the air, the unspoken standoff between them. And then, something unexpected happened. A new voice cut through the tension, calm and measured but carrying an undeniable authority. "I believe you've said enough." Ezra turned his head toward the sound, his curiosity piqued. The voice was unfamiliar, yet it carried the same commanding presence as Officer Williams. The man's bravado crumbled almost instantly. Look, I didn't mean anything by it," he stammered, his earlier defiance replaced by nervousness. The new voice spoke again, this time addressing Officer Williams. "Is there a problem here, officer?" "No problem," Williams replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Just ensuring everyone's safety." Ezra could hear the man's footsteps retreating, his muttered curses fading into the distance. The tension in the air began to dissipate, but Ezra's heart was still pounding. The new voice spoke again, this time addressing him directly. "Mr. Turner, my name is Marcus Reed. I'd like to speak with you if you're comfortable with that." Ezra frowned slightly, his curiosity growing. "What about?" There was a brief pause before Marcus replied. "I'll explain everything, but perhaps we could move somewhere quieter first." Ezra hesitated, unsure of what to make of the situation, but there was something about Marcus's tone, steady, reassuring, that put him at ease. "All right," Ezra said finally. Officer Williams spoke up. "I'll accompany you, if that's okay." "Of course," Marcus replied. The three of them moved away from the station, stepping into a nearby cafe. The warmth of the space was a welcome contrast to the cold outside, and the soft hum of conversation provided a soothing backdrop. They found a quiet corner, and Ezra took a seat, folding his cane neatly beside him. Marcus cleared his throat. "Mr. Turner, I wanted to reach out to you personally because I've been following your work at the community center. You've been making quite an impact." Ezra blinked in surprise. "You know about that?" Marcus chuckled softly. "I make it my business to know about people who are changing lives. And from what I've heard, you're doing exactly that." Ezra felt a flush of pride, but also confusion. "Why are you telling me this now?" Marcus's tone grew more serious. "Because what happened today shouldn't have happened, and because I believe people like you deserve better." Ezra frowned slightly, his skepticism returning. "I appreciate the sentiment, but what does this have to do with you?" Marcus hesitated for a moment before replying. "Let's just say I'm in a position to help, and I'd like to offer you an opportunity." Ezra leaned forward slightly, his curiosity piqued. "What kind of opportunity?" Marcus's voice softened. "One that could change everything for you, for the kids you mentor, and for the community you serve. But I need to know if you're willing to take a leap of faith." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Ezra's mind raced, trying to piece together what Marcus was offering. Before he could respond, the cafe door swung open, and a cold gust of air swept through the room. Ezra turned his head toward the sound, his senses alert. The man from the bus had returned, His heavy boots thudded against the floor as he approached, his presence unmistakable. Ezra's pulse quickened as he realized the confrontation wasn't over. Marcus stood, his posture calm but defensive. "Is there something I can help you with?" The man sneered, his eyes narrowing. "Yeah, you can start by staying out of my business." The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with unspoken threats. Ezra tightened his grip on his cane, bracing himself for whatever was about to happen. And then, in a voice that was both steady and unyielding, Marcus said, "Careful. You don't know who you're dealing with." The man's expression faltered, confusion flickering across his face. "What's that supposed to mean?" Marcus didn't respond immediately, but the weight of his words hung in the air like a challenge. Ezra couldn't see the man's reaction, but he could feel the shift in energy, the unspoken tension that hinted at something bigger, something that had yet to reveal itself. And as the seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity, Ezra knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The man's sneer faltered for just a moment under Marcus's steady gaze, but he quickly masked it with bravado. "What's that supposed to mean, huh?" he snapped. "You think you scare me?" Marcus didn't flinch. Instead, he folded his arms and replied calmly, "It's not about fear. It's about accountability, and I'm not the only one who's been watching." The words hit the man, like a sudden gust of wind knocking the certainty from his face. His bravado flickered. Ezra sat silently, listening intently. Though he couldn't see, he could feel the room's charged atmosphere, sharp and electric, like the air before a storm. He gripped his cane tightly, a strange mixture of curiosity and unease swirling in his chest. "What are you talking about?" the man demanded, his voice wavering slightly. Marcus tilted his head, his calm demeanor unshaken. "You're about to find out." At that moment, the cafe door swung open again and a new set of footsteps echoed into the space. These were precise, deliberate, and carried an air of authority. The room fell silent as everyone turned to see who had entered. Ezra felt a strange shift in the energy around him, as though the tension had reached its breaking point. "Mr. Tanner," a female voice called out, firm and commanding. The man, Tanner, spun around, his face paling. "What's this about?" he stammered. The woman stepped closer. "My name is Detective Ramirez, and I've been monitoring your activities for quite some time." Tanner's jaw tightened, his earlier arrogance melting into visible unease. "Monitoring? What the hell are you talking about?" Detective Ramirez ignored his question and turned to Ezra. "Mr. Turner, I'd like to thank you for your patience and courage. You've been more instrumental in this investigation than you realize." Ezra's brows furrowed in confusion. "Investigation?" Ramirez nodded. "We've been gathering evidence on Mr. Tanner for months. His harassment today wasn't an isolated incident. It's part of a pattern of behavior. And thanks to witnesses, including yourself, we finally have what we need to act." Ezra's heart raced as the pieces began to fall into place. The confrontation on the bus hadn't just been a random act of cruelty. It had been the tipping point in a larger, ongoing effort to bring Tanner to justice. Tanner's face turned red with a mixture of rage and panic. "This is ridiculous. You can't do this. I haven't done anything wrong." Marcus spoke up, his voice calm but firm. "You've done plenty, Mr. Tanner, and it's all on record." Tanner turned to Marcus, his eyes narrowing. "Who even are you? What gives you the right to—" Marcus cut him off, his tone as sharp as a blade. "I'm Marcus Reed, civil rights attorney and advocate, and I've been working with Detective Ramirez and others to ensure people like you are held accountable for their actions." Tanner's bravado shattered completely. His mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but no words came out. Detective Ramirez stepped forward, holding out a folder. "We have documented reports of your harassment, discriminatory behavior, and verbal abuse against multiple individuals. Today's incident was just the final straw." Ezra sat quietly, his emotions a whirlwind of disbelief, vindication, and relief. For so long, he had endured the subtle and overt challenges of navigating the world as a blind black man. And now, for the first time, He felt like the weight of those experiences was being acknowledged and addressed. Tanner's voice cracked as he tried to defend himself. "This is a setup. You're all out to get me. I didn't do anything." Marcus interrupted, his voice like steel. "You did. And now you're facing the consequences." The room was silent, save for the quiet hum of the cafe's background noise. Tanner stood frozen, his earlier arrogance replaced by the stark realization that he was no longer in control. Detective Ramirez turned to Ezra. "Mr. Turner, would you like to file a formal statement regarding today's incident? Your account will be invaluable in ensuring justice is served." Ezra hesitated, the weight of the moment settling over him. He thought back to his grandmother's words, the ones that had guided him through so many difficult times. "Your voice matters, Ezra. Don't let anyone silence you." Taking a deep breath, he nodded. "Yes, I'll do it." A small, encouraging smile crossed Ramirez's face. "Thank you. Your courage means more than you know." Tanner, meanwhile, was being escorted out of the cafe by another officer who had quietly entered during the exchange. His protests grew quieter as he was led away, the door swinging shut behind him. Ezra exhaled deeply, the tension in his body finally releasing. He turned toward Marcus, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "Thank you for stepping in." Marcus shook his head. "You didn't need me to step in, Ezra. You've already shown more strength than most people could ever imagine. I just did my part to make sure the right people were listening." Ezra's grip on his cane loosened as a wave of gratitude washed over him. For so long he had felt invisible, his struggles dismissed or ignored. But today, he had been seen, and not just by those who sought to tear him down, but by those who were determined to lift him up. As the cafe returned to its normal hum of activity, Ezra allowed himself a small smile. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time in a long time he felt like he wasn't fighting alone. The twist unfolds later that evening, as Ezra prepared to leave the station. Marcus walked him to the door. The chill of the night air bit at his face, but he didn't mind. "Marcus," Ezra said, his voice thoughtful, "why did you get involved in this? Why me?" Marcus hesitated for a moment before replying. "Because I see myself in you, Ezra. I've been where you are, pushed down, underestimated, overlooked, and I know how hard it is to keep going when it feels like the world is against you." Ezra nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of understanding. "Thank you," he said again, his voice soft but sincere. Marcus placed a hand on his shoulder. "Just remember, Ezra, you're not alone. There are people out there who see your worth, even when others don't. Don't ever forget that." As they parted ways, Ezra couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The events of the day had opened his eyes, not in the literal sense, but in a way that felt just as profound. He had been tested, pushed to his limits, and yet he had emerged stronger. And now, with the support of people like Marcus and Detective Ramirez, he felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. But as he walked away, his cane tapping rhythmically against the pavement, a question lingered in the back of his mind. Who else had been watching? The thought sent a shiver down his spine, not of fear but of anticipation. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. He was ready to face it head on. The first rays of sunlight streamed through the cafe's windows the next morning, illuminating the small but lively gathering inside. It had been less than 24 hours since Tanner's public humiliation and arrest, yet the air felt noticeably lighter. The patrons who had witnessed the confrontation now looked at Ezra with something new in their eyes. Respect. Ezra sat at his usual corner table, his hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. The cane that had so often felt like an emblem of his vulnerability now rested against his chair like a badge of honor. Though the events of the previous day still felt surreal, the murmured greetings and kind words from the other patrons reassured him that the impact had been real. As he sipped his tea, Marcus entered the cafe, a folder tucked under one arm and a determined look on his face. He spotted Ezra immediately and made his way over. "Morning," Marcus greeted, sliding into the seat across from him. "Morning," Ezra replied, offering a small smile. "I didn't expect to see you so soon." Marcus chuckled. "I figured you'd want to know what's happening with Tanner and what comes next." Ezra straightened slightly, his curiosity piqued. "I wasn't sure if I'd ever hear the full story. What's the latest?" Marcus opened the folder and spread out a few papers. Tanner's been charged with multiple counts of harassment and discrimination. His history of targeting individuals, especially minorities, is well documented, thanks to witnesses and prior complaints. Yesterday was just the final nail in the coffin. Ezra nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of Marcus's words. "Do you think he'll actually face consequences this time?" "I do," Marcus said firmly. "This case has already drawn attention from the media, and public pressure is mounting. People are tired of letting bullies like Tanner get away with it. The legal system has its flaws, but with enough evidence and support, justice can be served." For the first time in a long while, Ezra felt a flicker of hope that the world could change. Not overnight, but slowly, steadily, through moments like this. Reflection and growth. After Marcus left, Ezra decided to take a walk. The streets felt different now, not physically, of course, but in the way people moved around him. The sidelong glances that used to carry judgment now seemed to carry acknowledgement. The subtle whispers he used to strain to ignore were replaced by quiet nods of respect. As he walked, Ezra's thoughts drifted to his grandmother. He could almost hear her voice, warm and full of conviction. "Remember, Ezra, it's not about what happens to you. It's about what you do with it." He stopped at a nearby park and sat on a bench, his cane resting across his lap. The memory of his grandmother's wisdom brought a bittersweet smile to his face. She had always believed in his strength, even when he hadn't believed in it himself. "Thank you, Grandma," he whispered, his voice carried away by the breeze. In that moment, Ezra realized that the confrontation with Tanner, and everything leading up to it, had not just been about proving Tanner wrong. It had been about proving to himself that he was capable of standing tall, even when the world tried to knock him down. Community and change. A few weeks later, the cafe hosted an event unlike anything Ezra had ever seen. The owner, inspired by the events of that day, had organized a community gathering to discuss issues of inclusion and equality. The room was packed with people of all backgrounds sharing stories, ideas, and commitments to create a more supportive community. Ezra stood near the front of the room, his heart pounding as he prepared to speak. Public speaking wasn't something he had ever considered, but Marcus had encouraged him to share his story. Taking a deep breath, he stepped up to the microphone. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady despite the nerves. "My name is Ezra Turner, and I want to thank you all for being here tonight." The room fell silent as he spoke, every eye on him. Ezra recounted his experiences, both the challenges he had faced as a blind black man and the moments of resilience that had carried him through. "But this isn't just about me," he continued. "It's about all of us. It's about creating a world where no one has to feel invisible or less than. A world where kindness and accountability go hand in hand." When he finished, the room erupted into applause. Ezra felt a warmth spread through him, not just from the recognition, but from the realization that his story had resonated with others. Over the weeks that followed, Ezra became an unexpected advocate for change. He worked with Marcus to organize workshops, spoke at local schools, and even participated in a citywide campaign to promote accessibility and inclusion. The cafe became a symbol of transformation, a place where people from all walks of life could come together and feel seen. Consequences for Tanner. Meanwhile, Tanner's life took a sharp downward spiral. The charges against him gained significant media attention, and his reputation was irreparably damaged. Former colleagues and acquaintances came forward with their own stories, painting a damning picture of his long history of prejudice and abuse. In court, Tanner tried to downplay his actions, but the evidence was overwhelming. Witness testimonies, including Ezra's, left no room for doubt. He was convicted on multiple counts and faced both legal and financial consequences. For Ezra, the knowledge that Tanner was being held accountable brought a sense of closure. It wasn't about revenge, it was about justice. A hopeful future one sunny afternoon, Ezra returned to the cafe, this time with Marcus and Detective Ramirez. The three of them sat at a table near the window, reflecting on the journey they had shared. "I never thought I'd be here," Ezra admitted, a hint of wonder in his voice. "Speaking out, standing up, it all felt so impossible before." Marcus smiled. "You've always had it in you, Ezra. Sometimes it just takes the right moment to bring it out." Detective Ramirez nodded in agreement. "And you've inspired more people than you realize. Your courage has ripple effects." Ezra glanced out the window, watching as people passed by. He thought about how far he had come, not just in the past few weeks, but in his life. He still faced challenges, of course. The world wasn't perfect and progress was often slow, but he no longer felt alone in his journey. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the cafe, Ezra felt a deep sense of peace. He had faced his fears, stood up to injustice, and found his voice, and he knew without a doubt that his story was far from over.